morning, everyone. It's my great pleasure to welcome you all to Bloomberg's global headquarters for our 6th annual Data for Good Exchange conference. Now, it's been incredible to witness the increased interest and excitement for D4GX. This year, we had more than 1,200 people sign up to today's event before we had to cap registrations. We have presenters and attendees from around the world. 6 continents are represented here today, with participants coming from as far away as Argentina, Australia, Indonesia, Kenya, New Zealand, Singapore, South Africa, and Taiwan. Again, welcome to Bloomberg and thank you for participating. It seems that most of the industry and academic conferences are now including a Data for Good track or workshop in their programming. Next month, ODSC West will include a Data Science for Good track. NeuroIPS 2019 will host a joint workshop on AI for social good, and Triple AI 20 will include an AI for social impact track. An increasing number of academic and nonprofit organizations are using the tagline Data for Good. These developments underline the shared recognition of how important this subject is. To this end, I'm incredibly excited to announce that we're bringing Data for Good Exchange to London for the first time later this year, in collaboration with JPMorgan Chase. Now save the date, the evening of Thursday, November 21st, 2019, and look for more details about this first in a series of European D4GX events in your email in just a couple weeks. Our incredible program committee of 24 people this year was co-led by Srijith Menon and Jeanette Wing. Srijith is my colleague here at Bloomberg and works as an ML engineer. He has previously done research into and still has a personal passion for the use of AI to combat problems in animal conservation. Really interesting work. Jeanette Wing, as you probably know, is Avanescence Director of the Data Science Institute and Professor of Computer Science at Columbia University. The program committee had a lot of work cut out for them. They reviewed more than 120 panel, workshop, and paper proposals in creating today's jam-packed agenda. You'll find their names on the 3rd tab in the conference app at d4gx.com. I'd like to ask Srijith, Jeanette, and all those who served on the program committee to please stand up and raise your hand if you're standing in the back to be recognized. Let's give them a round of applause. Thank you. In preparation for this year's conference, I reviewed the results of our efforts so far. What have we achieved in the last 5 years? What are some of the outcomes? Let me just share a few of these things with you right now. Since 2015, when we held our first independent Data for Good Exchange conference, nearly 200 academic papers have been presented at our events. 4 years ago, we started an incredibly successful Immersion Fellows program in which we embed 5 to 10 grad students each year into a nonprofit or municipality. A number of pragmatic initiatives were completed around the world from Sao Paulo to Milan to Virgin Islands. In fact, you're going to hear more about an immersion program with the city of Bogota, Colombia. You'll learn more about what My Brother's Keeper is doing in Houston, Texas, as well as the Natural Areas Conservancy's work to present forests and wetlands here in New York City. After participating in our immersion program a couple years ago, Benefits Data Trust, a Philadelphia-based nonprofit, developed a data science practice and won a $1 million grant from the Rockefeller Foundation and Chan Zuckerberg Initiative to continue their work. I also want to thank our partners in making the immersion program happen. Justin Hendricks and Amy Chen of New York City Media Lab have helped us identify these incredibly talented data scientists from New York City academic institutions. We wouldn't be able to do this without your help. And Bloomberg, of course, Bloomberg Philanthropies, especially Bloomberg Associates Linda Gibbs and Rose Gilhern, for allowing these data scientists to contribute to the important work their teams are doing to bring added transparency to city governments and to enhance the delivery of social services in cities around the globe. And I want to thank my amazing colleague Amanda Stent for her expert help in the immersions program. It really wouldn't be as successful without her guidance. Here's another exciting development. Tomorrow, the city of Berlin and TXL Urban Tech Republic, Europe's biggest urban tech launchpad, will sign a memo of understanding with NYU and the Brooklyn Borough President on a data alliance that will enable teams to work on challenges related to one of Europe's biggest urban development projects, the Transform Tegel, if I'm pronouncing that right, airport in the city of Berlin. This concept was part of a 2017 D4GX paper that Cornell Tech's Arnaud Sauguet talked about during the TEP conference at Brooklyn Borough Hall last year, which the group of Berlin attended. These amazing connections are bearing fruit. Data ethics was a prominent topic in D4GX in 2017. Many of you will remember that we helped launch a community-driven movement to craft a code of ethics for data scientists in 2017. Originally called the Community Principles of Ethical Data Sharing, it is now known as the Global Data Ethics Projects. The working groups made up of data practitioners, ethicists, advocates developed a 5-point framework around fairness, openness, reliability, trust, and social benefits, or FORTS, and 10 global data ethics principles for data practitioners to apply their work with data. Promisingly, the subject of ethics in data science has grown to be a hot topic in the community. Academic institutions around the world are weaving data ethics courses into their curriculum. Large open source foundations such as Mozilla are working with philanthropic organizations to fund the development and piloting of ethics curricula. Advocacy groups are emerging to push for the adoption of ethics principles and transparency. And some of the companies and industry groups are joining the conversation. We were glad that we could play a small part in that evolution. If you want even more detailed update about this initiative's project, we've published an article at tech@bloomberg.com written by Mo Johnson, the Global Data Ethics Project Community Manager, which dives even deeper. You'll be able to find it in the conference web app. I encourage you to read it later today during one of our breaks. Now, before I get into today's topics, I want to thank Vicki Sorello for organizing this year's conference once again. She's amazing, and she put so much of her work into this year's events. Thank you, Vicki. And now let me take a few minutes to introduce today's conference theme, Data Science for SDGs, or how data scientists, corporations, policymakers, and researchers can collaborate on data science projects to move us towards achieving the UN Sustainable Development Goals by 2030. On January 1st, 2016, the 17 Sustainable Development Goals of the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development officially came into force. The agenda was originally adopted by all UN member states at the historic UN Sustainable Development Summit in September 2015. These 17 goals are structured around 5 pillars: people, peace, prosperity, planet, and partnership, which is also how we've organized today's agenda. With these universal goals, countries around the globe are mobilizing efforts to end poverty, fight all forms of inequality, and tackle climate change, while ensuring that no one is left behind. Data science must play a large role in helping governments and businesses achieve these goals. To really dive into the complexity of SDGs, we've invited 2 incredible experts who deal with this topic every single day. Francesca Perucci, Chief of the Statistical Services Branch of the United Nations Statistics Division in the Department of Economic and Social Affairs, and Claire Melamed, CEO of the Global Partnership for Sustainable Development Data. Francesca and her team are responsible for preparing the annual progress reports on the SDGs and for coordinating the activities around the improvement of data and statistics needed to implement the 2030 Agenda. The SDG indicators provide evidence-based insight whether today's actions are laying the foundation to achieve the SDGs. She will provide an overview of the SDGs, why they're important, share some of the data they're seeing, and the challenges faced with regards to the collection of some of the relevant data. She will also highlight the actions and programs undertaken by the United Nations to make better, more timely, open, and disaggregated data for the SDGs a reality. Claire heads up a global team based in 5 countries whose goal is to bring together governments, the private sector, and civil society organizations to use the data revolution to achieve the SDGs. She will show how data science is helping to achieve the SDGs and how the impact of new methods and ideas can be scaled up through partnerships between academia, the public sector, private sector, and civil society. Now, I'd like to invite Francesca to the stage to be our guide as we begin today's deep dive into SDGs. Thank you, enjoy today's conference.
Thank you, and good morning, everybody. Really a great pleasure and honor to be here. Thanks to Bloomberg's colleagues who invited us to have and participate in this discussion. The SDGs and all the challenges we face with trying to put together a story of the progress that we're making or not making on all the goals. So this is the agenda, the 17 goals. And as was just mentioned, the basic principle behind the agenda is to leave no one behind. So how do we ensure that that really happens? Of course, we need an unprecedented amount of data. And these data have to be accessible, they have to be timely, they have to be open, but they have to be disaggregated. So this is what we're doing. We prepare every year a report that looks like this, and is also on an interactive format. We call it the story maps on the website, and is accessible there. But we also need to ensure that every country also has the data they need to inform the measures to actually implement the agenda at the local level. So it's a lot more than just tracking progress with the 232 indicators. It's actually ensuring that everybody is counted in those data and everybody has access to those data. So what do we actually know? It's 2019, so already 4 years into the implementation of the agenda. And we have quite a bit of data. So what you see here is the percentage of indicators that are covered under each goal. So you see a lot of green, but even the green is not that positive in a sense, because you do have indicators, you do have data for some countries, but in many cases, you don't have enough to track the trends. You don't have enough to disaggregate and ensure that you count everyone under those indicators. And the amount of countries that actually have no data for any of the indicators is still quite substantive. So the story, is sort of encouraging in a sense, because there are efforts in trying to inform those and populate those indicators, but there is still a lot that needs to be done, and the areas that are more critically important to the most vulnerable people are still the areas where we don't see progress in terms of data production. So I just want to give you a few highlights. Of course, we won't have time to go through the whole report, but I just wanted to give you a few highlights so that you get a sense of what type of data we have and how we can actually track progress in all these areas. So and this is not all indicators that we have, of course, it's just a few. Of course, poverty is the first indicator that you see under Goal 1, and is the indicator that most people refer to as, how are we doing in terms of implementing the agenda? And you immediately see the challenge. The actual data we have are from 2015, which is the year the agenda was adopted. And what we have for 2018 is a nowcasting. And then we have projections. But we really don't have data in countries sufficient to estimate data every year and track progress. And the story is also not very encouraging in the sense that the progress that we've seen over the previous decade or so has slowed. And of course, that marginal, what remains to be done there is the most difficult to achieve. Those are the most vulnerable groups. Those are the people living in the marginalized area, the rural areas, etc. Similarly, hunger is another indicator that gets used a lot because it's easy to understand and it gives you immediately a sense of how you're doing. And that's also not a very good story. Actually, the number of people living in hunger, the undernourished ones, is increasing. And even the new estimates for 2018, the number is still increasing. So the story there is also not very encouraging. Again, as concerns people, which is one of the pillars, we see, of course, progress, and that's been already with the MDGs, very important progress in reducing child mortality, which is a very good indicator of how, overall also health systems work, etc. And the numbers dropped to 5.4 million in 2017. But again, you see this is 17, it's not even 18. So again, the lack of timely data is a huge gap. And vaccinations, also very encouraging. There's been a steep increase in campaigns and access to vaccinations, and that has certainly saved a lot of those lives that you see there. On Goal 5, which is a very important goal as it cuts across and has important impact on all other goals, also the story is not very encouraging. Women still bear the heaviest burden of unpaid domestic and care work, which of course represents a huge obstacle in terms of then accessing fully paid opportunities, and they're not well represented in decision making. And you see that, for instance, in the workforce, they represent 39% totally, but only 27% of the managerial positions. And the higher you go, of course, the fewer women you find. Planet, again, this is an area where we don't have a lot of data. But what we see is also quite scary and worrisome. And the material footprint, I'm sure many of you know, is increasing very, very rapidly and is estimated to reach 190 billion in 2060. Ocean acidity has increased by 26% since the pre-industrial times. A lot of plants and animal species are at risk of extinctions, and this is increasing and is worsened by almost 10% over the last 25 years and is still deteriorating very rapidly. Of course, atmospheric concentration of CO2 is 146% of pre-industrial level, and this is an estimate also 2017. Another important indicator that has a huge impact on health and many other areas of the SDGs is the pollution, air pollution in urban areas. And you see 9 out of 10 urban residents breathe air that is below the safety limit of WHO. Prosperity, that's the other pillar. We've seen some improvements, for instance, electricity, which is so fundamental for people to have access to be productive, is good, and it's been increasing, is accelerating, and in fact is accelerating even more in rural areas that are the areas that are suffering the most. But the gap is still very wide, so there is still a huge amount of work that needs to be done to provide electricity. And in urban areas, still a lot of people live in slum-like conditions. In fact, 1 out of 4 live in slums. And the big issue, and this was highlighted in the report this year, the 2 critical factors of the lack of progress in implementing the agenda: climate change and inequality. Those are the two main issues. And you see that in many countries, an increasing share of income goes to the top 1%, and we see that is increasing at a very rapid pace. And the bottom 40% receive less than 25% of total income. Finally, peace and partnership. Here again, not a very encouraging story. Trafficking, I picked this as one of the most important indicators in Goal 16. The number is actually increasing. It's not clear why it is increasing. There is also, of course, a component there that it's easier now to report. There are better tools to report. So a part of that could be the effect of better reporting, but it's also dramatically increasing. And of course, women and girls represent a huge percentage of that number. Birth registration. The indicator is particularly important because birth registration is a basic human right. It gives you access to everything. Without a birth certificate, human beings are not recognized as existing for the society. So it's key to improve that, but it's also key because, as we'll see later, civil registration and vital statistical systems are also key for the implementation of the agenda overall. They represent one of the most important sources of data. And it's still really very, very bad. Only 3/4 of children under age 15 are registered globally. And when it comes to particular areas, like in sub-Saharan Africa, less than half of children under age 5 are registered. And in all this, ODA, which is the official development assistance that developing countries receive, is decreasing. And of course, the official development assistance is a big component of the implementation of the agenda. It's not just about mobilizing domestic resources, it's also about ensuring assistance to countries, especially least developed countries, which is the number in the middle, and Africa. And you see, for those 2 groups of countries, it's even decreasing more significantly. So this is what we know, and of course there is a lot more, and there is also a lot more that you see countries are putting together in terms of data, but there is a lot that we don't know. And the main data gaps I'd like to sort of group into 3 areas. The timeliness. So we see that some data for some indicators are out of date, and in fact when you go to countries, sometimes they are even older data, because some of those data that you see there are estimated. But then the inclusiveness imperative. So we said this is an agenda that has a fundamental principle of leaving no one behind. So there's nothing we can do unless we really know who they are and what their needs are and how we are actually addressing their circumstances and their realities. But we see that data are not available for any of those disaggregation, those dimensions that were specifically mentioned in Agenda 2030, people with disabilities, migrants, refugees, the poorer, the older, and all the more marginalized groups. So we see that data are really not available widely for those groups. Also, indicators are not designed in such a way to really reflect the realities and the needs of those people. So it's not just a question of having the data, you also need to understand how to measure those realities. And sometimes it's not just the standard indicator, you really need to make an extra effort to understand how to develop the tool and how to develop the data collection methods for that. So you need to redefine and adjust the methodologies. And then a user-centric approach. We really need to understand what data need to be produced. And in some of the statistical systems, you still see sort of an old approach based on traditional statistical fields and not really based on what the users needs and what the users need and what decision makers really need to have in their hands. So we need to transform the way we produce and use data. And I think this dialogue today is very important for us coming from the official statistical community to understand how we can create a common platform to work together towards that. Of course, we feel that official statistics have to be the foundation for the system, and they have to provide sort of the basis to make sure that we produce good quality data. And I just chose two examples, civil registration and vital statistical systems. This is one very important area that can provide data. Of course, goal 3, health, is the goal that benefits the most from those statistics, from those data. But they can provide data for a lot of the goals. And the other area is household surveys. They can produce data for 80 indicators disaggregated by all the dimensions that Agenda 2030 called for. So just to say that we still need to rely a lot on the more traditional data collection tools, but we need to use them as a basis and build on them and bring a lot more methods and tools and technology. So we need to transform the process of data production and use. I like to stress that the first step is for national statistical systems to really establish partners with all new data actors. So it's for them also to find a way to change the way they operate and open up and create these partnerships. And they can provide the governance system to ensure data quality. They can help with protection of privacy and confidentiality, and they can help with the implementation of the fundamental principles of official statistics that somehow guarantee the data are really fair, you avoid biases, etc. But you need to expand the national statistical system, and you really need to bring all actors in. And I like to say all actors are both users and producers. We should not have this divide. All users are part of the statistical systems, and everybody, including citizens, can generate data. So we are all together in a common platform, in a common system. But we need to improve data communication and visualization because we need to understand the value of data and promote the value of data. Otherwise, we will never get enough political support to implement this. And of course, we need to mobilize resources. And there is a lot of work going on there, trying to get the support from at the political level, at the national level, domestically mobilizing resources, and also at the international level, getting more buy-in from donors who can help with this. And I'd like to say that data scientists need to be part of this transformation. So there's really a need for us to find a common platform where we can work all together. We need data scientists because through this data science, we can transform data into knowledge. So we can really bring the knowledge to the decision makers. We need data science because it helps us integrate structured and unstructured data. So there's not enough the National Statistical Office can do without the data scientists to really take advantage and leverage the power of all the new data sources. And of course, there is a need to create multidisciplinary partnerships and collaboration, which is something that national statistical systems have not been able to do fully until now. So very quickly, how do we make this happen? Well, some examples. The Global Working Group on Big Data was established by the UN Statistical Commission in 2014. And we have a global platform for big data where people can collaborate, bring different tools, etc. And we have Data for Now, which is an initiative that is in partnership with the 4 entities, the Global Partnership for Sustainable Development Data, SDSN, the World Bank, and ourselves at the UN. We need to integrate geospatial information with data and statistics. That's a very powerful way of using what we have. And we have a number of projects in the UN, including what we call the federated system for the SDGs that brings together different national data hubs on a GIS platform. And we need to increase the use of semantic web technologies to improve the visibility of what we have, of all the sources of data and the interoperability. And again, here we have a big project across the UN, bringing also different data actors to develop this. We now have some unique identifiers that we're using, so there is a lot going on also. So what is the vision? This is what we would like to see in the near future. This is what I just mentioned, the federated system for SDGs. We have a global data hub at the UN that links together the national hubs in countries. And I like to show this because I think this is a good way to ensure that countries have access to their data on a map, which is very important for policymakers, especially at the local level. It gives you a system to enable interoperability, to bring together different data sources, and it brings together all partners. Anybody can bring their data there at the national level and then make them visible at the global level. But also it gives you a sense that we really need to be interconnected and that we really need to have a platform where we can really work together and bring all this data together to really address the challenges of the agenda and the specifically data challenges of the agenda as soon as possible. And that's why we have Data for Now, which gives you that sense of urgency. And I like to stop here. And I think I'm introducing my dear friend Claire, who will speak after me.
Thank you. Always such a pleasure to follow my friend and partner in crime, Francesca. Before I start, I want to really pick up on one of the things that Francesca was talking about very much, which is the importance of thinking about what this looks like from the country level and at how all of the different products and data sources and data types that we're talking about are actually helping to feed into decision making and changing people's lives through what governments and others do in countries. So I thought rather than tell you, I would show you that and play a short video that really shows you some of what that looks like far better than words could ever do. So if we could have the video, please. We know that the world is an unequal place, but if you're excluded from the data, people don't know that you exist, so they can't even count the ways in which you are discriminated against. Being excluded from the data is one of the most basic exclusions of all. About 7% of the world's population were never counted. Not being counted means you're effectively invisible to government policymakers. Governments are not going to build a road or a school or a hospital for a population that they don't know is there. And of course, it's often the people who are already the poorest and the most marginalised who are missed out of the census.
In the case of Ghana, it is particularly important because we had some regions that persistently have not been able to go above the poverty line. We need to try and get everybody on board because of the peculiarities, the heterogeneities with poverty within the country. In some areas, that deprivation is in the area of water, in other areas is in the area of sanitation. So there is the need to understand the peculiarities at the very lower level.
Many governments do not really prioritize data collection. Money spent on data collection may not be very obvious to the average voter. But governments forget that without data, you'll get your policies wrong. Data is what tells you where you are and helps you get to where you want to get to.
Next year, we're going to have the 2020 population and housing census. The census is going to underscore all our activities heading towards tracking of the Sustainable Development Goals. We want to move away from the usual census and begin to consider the use of administrative data and big data.
Collecting good data from clinics, from schools, an effective census, these basic things that governments have to get right. One of the things that we at the Global Partnership have been working with them on is the Africa Regional Data Cube, which is an infrastructure that gives 5 of our partner governments in Africa access to satellite data. And the government of Ghana is using that in all sorts of ways to understand what's going on with the environment and with agriculture. We're already seeing how Ghana is doing is inspiring other countries in the region and beyond, seeing how countries can learn from each other and all progress together.
Thank you. So with that stirring music still in our ears from the video, I thought it would be nice to just pick up from where Francesca left off. I mean, I think that, we should not obviously ignore the fact that things can look pretty bad in the world at the moment. It feels very uncertain, it feels dangerous, it feels, full of threats known and unknown, but also full of possibilities, the kind of possibilities that you saw in that video. And I think one of the important things to remember about the Sustainable Development Goals is to sort of take a step back and remember that the goals paint a picture of the world as it could be. And they're unique in all of the utopias that we have presented to us, in that they are a sort of politically sanctioned utopia. The SDGs are a politically agreed vision, an ambitious vision for what the world could be. And that's quite unique. And just imagine, before we get too sunk in gloom about the state of the world now, just pause for a second and imagine a world in which the SDGs had been agreed. A world where there's no hunger, where there's gender equality, where climate change is no longer a threat. And the SDGs are the universally agreed vision for that world. Having said that, how we get there is, of course, the question. And as our dear friend, the Vice President of Ghana said in that video, it's data that gives you the map for where you're starting from and how you get to where you want to be. And I think it's data science in particular that has a particular role in giving us that bigger picture. Because it's data science and uniquely looking at different data sources, statistics, of course, but also all of the data sources that we now have available to us in the world that can pick up the patterns that we're seeing in our society and the environment around us that underpin how we live our lives. And sometimes it's very hard to see those patterns any other way. This is a picture of Lake Chad. Lake Chad, a part of the world that we don't think about very often, probably not enough, has shrunk by 90% over the last 40 years. And imagine what that means for people's lives. We had, imagine the trailer loads of fish that were traveling north to south, underpinning the lives and the livelihoods of thousands of people. They've been replaced by empty roads, by livelihoods lost, and of course leading to increased poverty, to instability, to some of the kind of negative trends that we're seeing in the SDG report that Francesca talked about. It's a change that's happened incrementally, slowly, little by little. It's hard to see if you live there and what you're seeing is the changes month by month or week by week. But looking at the patterns in data can show us the changes that are happening and show us how stark they can really be. This is just a picture over a few years of how that lake is shrinking. If you're there seeing it every day, you don't notice these kind of changes. But it's data that can tell the story of these changes and the changes that in the end add up to success or failure on the SDGs. But of course, as all of you know who deal with data every day, that data doesn't just fall into our laps. We have to look for it, and we have to look at it and extract the stories that it's telling us, which are not always as obvious as they might appear here. And then, of course, and this is the absolutely critical point, and sometimes we get stuck here, we have to put it to use, and we have to use it to make the decisions that can change the story. For many years, again, as Francesca said, and as came out so powerfully in that video, the stories, the data stories of those most remote communities, like the people who live on the far shores of Lake Chad, it was almost impossible to collect. You couldn't get there in a truck to do a survey. Census takers wouldn't go to those far and often unstable regions. But now, thanks partly to new technologies, to satellites and sensing, to mobile technologies, digital censuses and surveys, we can know more about our world and the people in it. And armed with that knowledge, we can do more. And we can do more to accelerate progress towards the Sustainable Development Goals. And all of that, almost anything now that we want to do with new data sources, with using the technological possibilities that are in front of us, involves partnerships. It involves groups who don't know each other, who are not used to working together, who perhaps are not always comfortable with each other, getting together and working out how to use their collective and often different approaches and understanding and knowledge to solve problems. Some of the groups that I've been in over the last few years running the Global Partnership have included data scientists and farmers, for example, space agencies and plumbers, statisticians and activists. They all have part of the answer, but they have to find ways to work together. And that's where we come in. I'm very proud to be the CEO of the Global Partnership for Sustainable Development Data, and we're all about making those connections between the partners, like, for example, the government of Ghana, and in fact, looking out at with many of you in this room. Since our foundation in 2015, we were born out of this same process as the Sustainable Development Goals. We were launched in 2015 as the goals themselves were agreed. The Global Partnership has brokered over 50 separate partnerships to improve the production and the use of data, to create the map and build the road that will take us to the Sustainable Development Goals. That is over one a month, I realised, as I was working on our board papers for next week's meeting. And I think now we're understanding, as we start to see the impact that some of those partnerships are starting to have in the real world, that as we're understanding the story, it is giving governments, giving the other organisations that we work with, the power to change it. We heard already in the video about the Africa Regional Data Queue, which gives 5 countries in Africa access to the data and to the algorithms, and critically to training and capacity development support to provide insights in some key policy areas in agriculture, in mining, in water. You saw some of the video pictures of mines in Ghana. These are images from the Africa Regional Data Cube that show very clearly where mining activity is happening. Before they had access to this satellite imagery, and I think it's really important to say here that this is not just a question of access to the data. This is data that was open already, but governments weren't using it because they didn't have the skills, they didn't have the technical support to be able to extract all the insights from that data that were then useful for policy making. And that's really the difference that the partnerships between governments, between NASA, the Space Agency, between Amazon Web Services, many of our partners, including some of you in this room, have been involved in delivering the Africa Regional Data Cube. And this is just one of the ways in which it's starting to make a difference. In Ghana, they have a real issue, a political issue, but also an environmental and a health issue with illegal mining. Those of you with long memories or history degrees will know that Ghana used to, in colonial days, was called the Gold Coast, and it's called that for a reason. There's still huge amounts of gold in the underground, and people are still trying to extract it, including many illegal miners who perhaps aren't burdened by the same concern for environmental or health impacts as some of those with government licenses are. And the government, with its very scarce resources, was not able to actually physically locate those illegal mines and shut them down. But now, armed with this data from the satellite imagery, they're able to see physically where illegal mining is likely to take place and direct their resources, direct their trucks, direct their enforcement agencies to go and shut those mines down. And actually, using data from the Regional Data Cube and other satellite imagery, the government of Ghana has shut down 47 illegal mines in the last few years that otherwise would not have been able to be shut because they simply wouldn't have known that they existed. And then, of course, a large part of what we help with these kind of data infrastructures, huge amount of what we do, of course, is just bringing people together. So we're working, for example, with computer programmers, data scientists, like many of you here in Freetown, to work with the city authorities to help them to provide tools that will allow the city authorities to track and deal with urban waste. You know, those of you who are familiar with many big cities in Africa will know that there's a huge problem for very fast-growing cities, poor infrastructure, and a huge challenge in trying to understand how to get rid of growing amounts of urban waste. Well, data and data scientists are part of the picture in solving those very specific policy problems. And of course, all of these things are urgent. If we are going to achieve the Sustainable Development Goals, we launched them in 2015. It seemed like, oh, it was a long way off, 2030, that's ages away, 15 years. Suddenly, here we are 4 years later. And next year, we're going to be 1/3 of the way through the period that takes us to the goals. Suddenly, everything feels a lot closer, and the sense of urgency is growing. And I think it's that urgency, that sense of a kind of accelerating need for urgent actions that makes the fact that so much of our data is now out of date particularly frustrating and just maddening, frankly, that in a world where, everybody, I bet all of you today have a phone in your pocket, where there are thousands of satellites flying overhead at any given moment. Some governments are using data to achieve the SDGs that was collected before the SDGs were even agreed. You think about this, how fast the world moves, how fast problems seem to sort of come up the track and things change. We're trying to build this world of the future with maps. If data is providing the maps to the future, a lot of those maps are ones that were drawn years ago when the world was very different. And to suddenly change the metaphor on you, if the planet now is like a car that's sort of hurtling at hundreds of miles an hour along the expressway, the drivers, the governments whose responsibility it is to get us all there safely, are actually navigating by looking in the rearview mirror. And that's not a particularly comforting image, I think, for any of us. I mean, for example, just to take a sort of, perhaps what, as Francesca said, SDG 1 and the number of people that are living in extreme poverty, which is sort of taken often as the kind of exemplar of the goals. We have to be making progress on that to really have a chance of achieving the ambition that we've set ourselves. For 2/3 of the population of Africa, when you look at those poverty figures that are released, this year, last year, the surveys on which those figures from which those figures are estimated for 2/3 of the population of Africa were done before the goals were even agreed. And think how fast the world is changing, how rapidly people's jobs are changing, urbanization, migration. We can't be making policy on this basis. And of course, it actually matters. Why does it matter? Well, it means, just to take one example that a colleague said to me the other day, it means that vaccines are going out of date. Because in one part of the country, vaccines are piled up and not being used, while in another part of the country, children are dying through lack of vaccines because the data on births is so poor and so out of date that the government doesn't know they're not sending the vaccines to the right place because they don't know where the children are being born in any given day or month. And it means that farmers are planting crops on the basis of knowledge from a world that predates the climate crisis because they're not getting up-to-date data on weather, on soil quality, on all of those things that are absolutely the bread and butter of their livelihoods and of how they feed all of us. So what this means is that we're not using kind of the most precious resource that we have. The thing that marks us out as a species is our knowledge and our ability to think our way through problems. That's kind of what we have as human beings. And we're not using it in the best way to meet this global challenge that we've set ourselves and achieve the Sustainable Development Goals. So, we need all of you and all of us to change this view, to look out of the front windscreen and not the rear view mirror as we're driving. And we need to come back to something I said earlier and to use a word that is perhaps a little bit overused today, but nonetheless massively important. We need partnerships. And partnerships is easy to say, it's not so easy to do. If there's one thing that I've learned in my almost exactly 3 years of running the global partnership, where partnership is absolutely everything that we do and what we're about, it's that it's much harder than it perhaps first appeared when I took the job. And there are 3 things, just to leave you with, there are 3 things that I didn't know when I started this job, but that I do know now about how to build a successful data partnership. And I thought that to kind of help you think through the rest of the day and think through how to really make sure that you're using all of your skills and knowledge and the work that you do in the best way, which is always going to involve collaborating with others, I thought that I would leave you with those 3 lessons as my contribution to the day's business. So the first is about scale and is about matching problems with solutions at the right scale. What I often find really frustrating is when you see a brilliant solution to a difficult problem, but it's just not the problem that you're actually trying to solve at that moment. So if you're a policymaker, for example, is trying to kind of reboot the whole system of agricultural data for long-term planning, then a gadget that may be a brilliant gadget that provides data on soil quality is not going to solve your problem. And there's no amount of hard sell by anyone is going to persuade you that it does. It's just going to be frustrating. But on the other hand, if you're trying to provide farmers with updates on soil quality to inform their weekly or monthly planting decisions, then some big fancy platform for visualizing the data that needs lots of bandwidth isn't the answer either. That's where you need your soil quality monitor. So getting the scale wrong is where partnerships often fail or just never really get off the ground. And I think what I have seen over the last few years is that the magic that happens when you are matching the problems and solutions at the right scale, whether it's this continent-wide infrastructure for satellite or or a local platform to guide the administration in a single province in Kenya in response to the needs of that administrative authority. So I think the first question that we should always ask ourselves when we're thinking about a new data partnership is this, does the solution match the problem? The second one is to understand how all of the different parties who in the conversation understand what success looks like. So we often hear, as you know, in events like this, we often hear about the use case. Does something actually work? And of course, that is absolutely the most fundamental question that we have to ask. It's not much point in proceeding any further if the answer to that question is no. But for a partnership to actually endure and have impact, it has to offer something more than just use. It has to be useful to both sides. And in the private sector, of course, you talk about the business case. It has to be useful in the sense of being sustainable and answering a need in the market. In the public sector, you might frame it more in terms of value for money. Is this a good use of resources compared with all of the other things that a government might do with those resources to solve the many, many problems that are on their plate at any given moment? But what you need is both sides need to understand what's the plan. How are we going to get from use to useful through this specific partnership? And then I think the third lesson, which perhaps should be the first lesson, is the kind of most basic thing of all, is just learning how to talk to each other. In March every year, I always have an odd 2 weeks where I go, first of all, to Mobile World Congress, which is, for those of you who don't know, is the kind of industry conference for the mobile phone industry. And it's huge. It's held in Barcelona across a huge exhibition center. The volume is unbelievable. It's full of people sort of selling and pitching and being excited and demonstrating things to each other. And for me, it's become the sort of symbol of industry conferences and how industry talks to each other. And from then, I come to New York and come to the Statistics Commission, which is the group of official statisticians who work in governments who are dealing with the kind of really serious business of making sure that governments get access to the data that they need and that they will be held accountable for. So it's a serious undertaking. What really strikes me about this is that, in the private sector conferences I go to, it's all about projects. It's all about being out there, communicating, selling, pitching. Whereas often in governments, and particularly with senior officials, your power comes from withholding information. You want to find out what the other guy knows, but you don't really want to let on what you know. So the volume is very much lower. But I think, for that, to bridge that sort of cultural divide, if we're going to be making successful partnerships between public and private sector, and if all of the amazing stuff which is produced, including most of the new data, which is produced in the private sector, is going to be useful for governments and for others who are trying to sort of achieve the SDGs and set these long-term plans, then absolutely have to learn to understand each other. So we're on a difficult path with an inadequate map, and providing the data that we all need to plan, to act, to learn, and in the end to achieve the Sustainable Development Goals is a job for everyone. So everyone in this room is a part of that. And certainly you can rely on our support as you all individually and together are building the tools that are shining the light into the future. Thank you.